Amendment 30 expresses the sense of Congress that the royalty rate for onshore federal oil and gas leases be 12.5%. This amendment establishes that it is the sense of Congress that the royalty rate of onshore federal oil and gas leases be 12.5%, the pre-Inflation Reduction Act level. The so-called Inflation Reduction Act was filled with horrific policy and has only made things worse. The Inflation Reduction Act is geared to severely harm American energy independence by, among other things, increasing royalty rates and fees while restricting access to energy resources. Our country needs to produce more energy, not less, but Democrats designed their extreme climate agenda to restrict oil and natural gas production. One measure of the so-called Inflation Reduction Act enabled the Biden administration to raise the oil and gas royalty rate for certain offshore leases from the current 12.5% to 16.67%. This measure will only result in less oil and gas production, harming consumers and our national security. The Biden administration doesn't even pretend otherwise. Interior Secretary Deb Haaland said it resets how and what we consider to be the highest, best use of American resources. This is about the use of the land, and the Biden administration clearly wants to block all of our lands from the use for oil and gas production. My amendment simply returns onshore royalty rates to what it was 2 years ago, before this radical Democrat intervention. This amendment would affirm the intent of the underlying bill, which would reset the royalty rate for onshore leases to 12.5%. Mr. Chair, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman rise?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise to claim opposition to the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized.
You know, the underlying legislation would already roll back all the positive reforms Democrats have made to the oil and gas leasing program in the Inflation Reduction Act. For too long, Big Oil paid the taxpayers a pittance for publicly owned gas and oil they extracted and sold for an enormous profit. In the IRA, the Democrats fixed our outdated royalty rates, bringing them in line with the royalty rates charged by states. Studies have shown that this will have no impact on gas prices, but it will bring a fair return to the taxpayers. Republicans want to repeal our reforms, lower royalty rates, again, a giveaway to an industry that clearly doesn't need it. These low royalty rates are part of the reason this bill increases the deficit. So much for that fiscal responsibility and restraint. Big Oil doesn't need to give away. They're rich and getting richer. I urge a no vote on the amendment and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
I yield to the gentleman from Arkansas as much time as necessary. Chairman Westerman.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Chair, this amendment says that the sense of Congress is that the royalty rate should be 12.5%, which was the royalty rate before the very misleading and misnamed bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, was passed by my colleagues on the left. And we all know that it wasn't an Inflation Reduction Act, and they publicly call it their climate bill. President Biden has called it the climate bill. And the increase in the royalty rates was simply another way to attack our energy resources here in America. The Democrats know that. The Biden administration knows that. The officials in the Biden administration know that. And in a bill that they called the Inflation Reduction Act, they actually increased inflation by passing a law to say we're going to raise the cost of energy off of federal lands. It didn't take the market to do it. It was done by the law passed by my colleagues across the aisle. And if you don't believe what I'm saying, take the word of the Biden administration. Earlier this month, the Biden administration confirmed this fact in a leaked Bureau of Ocean Energy Management memo on Cook Inlet Lease Cell 258. The memo reads, and this is in response to BOEM trying to do an 18.75% rate, trying to put the highest rate they could on this cell. The memo reads, quote, a 16.2% royalty may be more likely to facilitate expeditious and orderly development of outer continental shelf resources and potentially offer greater energy security, end quote. The Biden administration knows this. They know the lower the royalty rate, the more likely we will have energy security, the more likely we will develop our resources. But they choose to use the highest rate possible to do everything they can to attack American energy, to attack American jobs. It's putting Russia and OPEC over the American people because we're still going to use energy. We're not using less energy, we're just using it from different sources. And laws like this that were passed on a partisan basis last Congress were signed into law by the Biden administration. They simply put these bad actors over the American people. It's time we lower energy costs and we pass the Lower Energy Cost Act and we pass it with this great amendment by my friend from Tennessee. I support the amendment and I yield back to the gentleman from Tennessee.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you. Let me remind everyone that big oil giants reported their largest profits in history in 2022, together making over $1 trillion in sales, all while the American families were struggling. You know, we can't continue to rely on the decades-old Republican baby drill mantra to lower prices for Americans. Policies that make us more dependent on fossil fuels will keep subjecting Americans to the whims of dictators and global market shifts, which means always higher energy prices. Instead, we can invest in clean energy here at home. We can reach our true energy independence, bring stability to the American families, and fight climate change all at the same time. With that, I reserve the balance.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
It should be noted that the largest oil profit was realized by Saudi Arabia, and I urge my colleagues to support the bill. I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
You know, I just would like to once again remind everyone that HR1 is the pinnacle piece of legislation for the Republican majority. And this bill, as the debates have shown and throughout these last few days, is a boondoggle. It's a giveaway, and HR1 puts us back into the position of less protection for the American people, less protection for our environment, and sets us back in the struggle with the ticking time bomb of the climate crisis. HR1 and this amendment continue that pattern. I urge a no vote. And as far as HR1, Polluters Over People Act, if this is the pinnacle of legislative effort on the part of the Republican majority, one can only wonder why we are not concentrating, giving time to the gun violence that is all around us in this country, the recent deaths of children and adults at the Christian church. That is not an issue with this Republican majority. In fact, they've said they can't do anything about it, that the sacrosanction of the Second Amendment prevents them from doing anything. And yet, HR1, the pinnacle, the zenith of their legislative effort, undercuts basic protections for the American people, fundamental core laws and environmental laws that have protected the American people since the 1970s. HR1 and this amendment deserve to be defeated, and I reserve the balance.
Gentleman has
I yield back the balance.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Tennessee. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 31, printed in Part B of House Report 11830. For what purpose does the gentleman from Tennessee seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 31, printed in Part B of House Report Number 118-30, offered by Mr. Ogles of Tennessee.
Pursuant to House Resolution 260, the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Ogles, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. My amendment provides that any entity subject to the jurisdiction of the government of the People's Republic of China, or any entity that is owned by the government of the People's Republic of China, may not acquire any interest with respect to the land leased for oil or gas under the Mineral Leasing Act, the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, and may not acquire claims subject to the General Mining Law of 1872. We need to secure our land and not to make it available for foreign governments, especially the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. The CCP is one of the greatest threats to American democracy and our homeland. Since at least 2007, the Department of Defense has consistently recognized China's dominance in the mining of key minerals as a leading national security threat. The Biden administration is recklessly pursuing a green agenda that makes the United States economy more dependent on critical mined minerals used to make things like batteries. We cannot continue to allow the genocidal CCP to control the supply chain. We certainly must ensure that the CCP cannot expand its market power by controlling mines, even in our own country. I urge adoption of my common sense amendment in the sake of our people and our national security. Mr. Chairman, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I ask for unanimous consent to claim time in opposition, though I'm not opposed.
Without objection, the gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of the amendment. During our markup of this bill in the committee, Representative Gosar offered a similar amendment to this one, though it applied only to oil and gas, not mining. I asked if he would consider adding mining to that ban, but that was declined. I also had an amendment to this bill to include mining in this ban, and which was not made in order. However, this Republican amendment, which is very similar to my own, was made in order. I am glad to see that at least some Republicans have come around to the point of including mining as part of the ban. If we don't want the Chinese Communist Party developing oil and gas leases on federal land and waters, then we shouldn't be supportive of the CCP mining on publicly owned minerals. It isn't hard to find that many foreign-owned parent companies have terrible records of human rights abuses, environmental degradation, harming indigenous communities, and destroying sacred sites. Some foreign companies, specifically several owned by the government of China, are known to have horrible records on all these fronts, and yet they can operate freely on our federal land, including in my home state of Arizona, through their subsidiaries. I repeatedly heard from my colleagues that we agree that human rights and environmental abuses are wrong. But so far they have refused to address the problem. As the demand for these minerals increases, let's not rush to open our lands to just anyone who wants to mine. Let's take a closer look at who is operating on our federal lands and work to raise the global standard. Let me remind members that under our outdated 150-year-old mining law, mining claimants do not pay a cent, not one penny, to the public's value for the public's valuable resource that they extract and turn around and sell. Nothing. There's a better deal. That's a better deal that even oil and gas get. We absolutely should not be handing our public mineral resources over to the CCP with no fair return to the American people. No return to the American people at all, with the result would be simply just to destroy our lands. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield to the gentleman from Arkansas. Mr. Chairman Westerman, as much time as necessary.
Gentleman from Arkansas is recognized.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the gentleman for yielding. And I want to thank the ranking member. Appreciate bipartisan support on this very important amendment. And I think this is a sign that we're making progress. This is a sign that America is coming together to stand up against the Chinese Communist Party. And we need to stand up not only against them, but we need to continue standing up against Russia, against OPEC. And that's what HR1 does. It's a bold step in the right direction, and this is a small part of it. And I commend the gentleman from Tennessee for crafting this amendment, for getting it made in order. I support the amendment, and for very good reason, because we simply cannot let the Chinese Communist Party continue to dominate and take control of not only mineral supply chains, but energy supply chains, as they are trying to make a move in that area as well, where they're cozying up with the Saudis. They're working with Russia to buy the oil and gas that we've banned from there, and their objective is dominance. And they've made great strides in the minerals area, and they're working very hard to do that in the energy. The way we push back against China and the CCP is we produce our energy and minerals here, and we for sure don't let China come to America and own any kind of lease on federal lands or private lands. We produce it ourselves. We send it to our allies. There was a delegation recently in Germany, and the message they brought back from Germany was gas equals peace. They want us to send them our gas. And we've got ample supplies of it. We just need the pipelines, we need the ports, we need the LNG facilities, we need the vessels to send gas to Europe that's much cleaner than the gas they're getting from Russia, and will help bring peace in Europe if they can get more of our energy here. I again commend the gentleman. I support the amendment, and I yield back my time to the gentleman from Tennessee.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you very much. And let me just give one important example of what this amendment addresses. In my home state of Arizona, Oak Flat, an area sacred to the Apache people and other indigenous tribes in Arizona and in New Mexico, there was a deal made to give federal land to a foreign-owned mining company, Rio Tinto. It's a subsidiary, local subsidiary, domestic, but owned by Rio Tinto, which is also partially owned by the Chinese government. This company has a horrible track record around the globe. In 2020, it demolished a 46,000-year-old Australian Aborigine site, an irreplaceable cultural artifact and sacred site to expand an iron mine. And this amendment stops rolling out the welcome map for these mining companies. I urge support of the amendment and yield back the balance.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I think Chairman Westerman, I think my colleague from across the aisle, it should be noted that it's the CCP that launched a reconnaissance balloon across our country. It's the CCP that is flooding our country with fentanyl and killing our kids and poisoning our country. I urge adoption of this amendment, and let's send a message to China that we've had enough. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Tennessee. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. For what purpose
on
does
that,
the
we
gentleman...
would ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6, Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Tennessee will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 32, printed in Part B of House Report 11830. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got an amendment at the desk as approved by the Rules Committee.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 32, printed in Part B of House Report number 118-30, offered by Mr. Perry of Pennsylvania.
Pursuant to House Resolution 260, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment simply ensures that no undue influence can be wielded by the Chinese Communist Party using an existing provision, which I think reflects the overall sentiment behind this anti-CCP enforced labor provision of the entire bill. The underlying section allows the Secretaries of Agriculture and Interior to accept and expend funds from non-federal entities in order to pay for staff and information technology system development to expedite permit processing. They are authorized to accept funds in fiscal years 2023 through 2025. This amendment prohibits those secretaries from accepting contributions from non-federal entities owned by the Communist Party of China or a person or entity acting on behalf of the Communist Party of China. Seems pretty common sense. There are already provisions in the bill which would prohibit the CCP's involvement in certain parts of our energy market. They should not be allowed to participate in this one any more than they do in the others. There's no reason that our government should be accepting money from this well. Let's remind ourselves that we're not talking about the people of China that wish to breathe free like all people in the world do. We're talking about the Communist Party of China. We don't need anything from them. With that, I urge support and adoption of this amendment, and I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona rise?
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent to claim time in opposition, although I am not opposed.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
I rise in support of this amendment. Environmental reviews are how we learn about a project's potential impacts on our lands, water, and public health. They're a critical safeguard against harmful industry practices. This section of the bill, this amendment amends, says that project sponsors can find their own environmental reviews. The entire section is wrong, and this amendment begins to recognize that. It would ban the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Interior from accepting funds for environmental review from the Chinese Communist Party. But my question is, why stop there? What about other foreign adversaries? What about the entities that have committed human rights abuses? What about the entities that have lobbied the federal government? How do we ensure that any outside funding will be clear of conflicts of interest? From my view, we can't. The federal government should have the sole responsibility to conduct unbiased environmental review because the federal government is responsible for protecting its citizens. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
I thank the chairman, and I thank my colleague from the other side of the aisle that we're finally willing to get together, Democrats and Republicans, and be tough on the Communist Party of China. But with that, I yield to the good gentleman, the chairman of the committee, for as much time as he may consume.
Gentleman from Arkansas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, and thank you for bringing this amendment that makes a very clear and stark reality that we don't need the Chinese Communist Party. America does not need the CCP. They need us. They need us to buy the goods that they're producing. They need us to buy the minerals that they're mining out of mines they've developed with child slave labor in Africa. They need us to develop or to buy the stuff they're producing with slave labor in China. But we don't need them. And we sure don't need their money here. And I appreciate the ranking member realizing that. I appreciate that the people are speaking. The House of Representatives is the voice of the people, and I believe this is how America feels. But we need to go further. We need to put action to our words. We need to show the CCP that America is strong, that we have our own resources, that we can develop these resources better than they can develop them. We can put these resources out on the world market, and instead of being dependent on others, we can be the ones exporting our goods, growing wealth and jobs here, and being a deterrent to the spread of communism, to the spread of dictatorships, and to all those things that we as Americans deplore. This is about, at the end of the day, it's about freedom, and it's about promoting those values that our country was founded on. Again, I support this amendment, appreciate the gentleman bringing it. I yield back to the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you very much. And I concur with much of what the Chairman Westerman said. I support the amendment. I don't think it goes far enough. I think that as we confront the question that he brought up of Chinese communism and their influence and their participation in in activities on our public lands and waters, that we need to make sure that that doesn't occur. But I would extend that further. I would extend it to cronyism. I would extend it to inside trading. I would extend it to large corporate interests, many times of foreign-owned companies, dictating our energy policy and production for this country. The point that we have here, and as representatives of our constituents and the federal government, is to protect the American people. And to protect the American people is to make sure that their public health and their right to know and their right to seek redress is protected. HR1 does not do this. This amendment is a step in that direction, but the underlying bill does not. And with that, I yield back the balance.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
I thank my colleagues and urge support of the amendment, and I yield the balance.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Pennsylvania. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 33, printed in Part B of House Report 11830. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I've got an amendment at the desk as approved by the House Rules Committee.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 33, printed in Part B of House Report number 118-30, offered by Mr. Perry of Pennsylvania.
Pursuant to House Resolution 260, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment simply extends existing reporting requirements. The underlying section allows the Secretaries of Agriculture and Interior to accept and expend funds from non-federal entities in order to pay for staff and information technology system development to expedite permit processing. They are authorized to accept funds in fiscal years 2023 through 2025. In the original bill text, both secretaries are required to submit annual statements to the committees of jurisdiction explaining why one or both of the following scenarios occurs. They do not accept funds contributed, or they accept but do not expend the funds contributed. This amendment adds the requirement that both secretaries submit a report to the committee of jurisdiction that includes, for each expenditure authorized, the amount of funds accepted and the contributing non-federal entity. I know most folks probably don't read these reports and they throw them in a pile. However, for future oversight efforts, it's important for the U.S. Congress to both specifically enumerate that agencies retain this information and then require them to provide it to us so not only we can see it, but the American people can see how the money's being spent and who's spending it and who's giving it. I urge adoption of the amendment, and I reserve the balance.
Purpose does the gentleman from Arizona rise?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise to claim time in opposition to the amendment.
Without objection, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment requires the Department of Interior and the Forest Service to do very basic reporting on funding that the agency would start receiving under the bill from outside groups for processing permits. The agencies would only have to report at the end of each year how much money they got from which outside groups, not which permits that the money funded. That won't do much, if anything, to prevent conflicts of interest and corruption in permitting. The section that this amendment amends is very, very bad. To me, the amendment demonstrates that some Republicans are noticing the absurdity. Instead of requiring after-the-fact reporting on outside money influencing our permitting process, why not prevent conflict of interest in the first place? Again, the federal government should have the sole responsibility to conduct unbiased environmental reviews because the federal government is responsible for protecting its citizens. I urge a no vote, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield as much time as he may consume to the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Westerman.
Gentleman from Arkansas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, thank you to the gentleman from Pennsylvania for yielding. I do rise in support of this amendment. HR1 would allow non-federal entities to provide money to certain federal agencies to improve permitting efficiency. And this good governance amendment that's offered by my friend from Pennsylvania would require the secretaries who accept this money to report on where it came from and how much was provided. And I think there's some confusion about the intent of what's in HR1 about speeding up permitting. And Mr. Chairman, before I came to Congress, I did engineering work for over 2 decades. I'm a professional engineer, so I worked on a lot of projects where permits were required. Fortunately, we were working with state permitting agencies, and we would hear the same argument from the state permitting agencies. We don't have enough resources and enough people to do these permits. It's going to take longer. And a lot of states have programs where they allow the entity trying to attain the permit to pay money to the agency so their employees can work overtime. And it is really a way to increase the resources and get more out of the resources. It's not degrading the environmental protections at all. It's just moving the process forward at a faster rate. And that's what the intent of HR1 is to move permitting at a faster clip so we can build all kinds of energy. So we can build solar farms and windmills and high voltage transmission lines, so we can build pipelines, so we can extract minerals and resources here in America. We can process those, we can manufacture things from them. And this is important to making our country a leader in the world by overcoming the position we're in with China on minerals, the position we're in with Russia and OPEC. And I support the underlying principle in the bill, and I support the good governance amendment by my friend from Pennsylvania, and I yield back my time to him.
I thank the chairman, and I thank him for his comments. And again, the provision already exists. All we're saying is that we should be able to, the American people should be able to follow the money. And if there's a report that says this is where the money came from and this is where it was spent or it wasn't spent, then we can follow the money and we know. That's all we're asking for. That's all this does. It doesn't slow anything down, doesn't speed anything up, just says you're capable, you're able, there's a way to follow the money. I urge adoption and I yield the balance.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's a way to speed up and deal with the backlog. We Democrats in the Inflation Reduction Act fought for and included a $1 billion to deal specifically with NEPA and the review process, to bring it up to capacity, staff it, and the same can be done for the other agencies, endangered species reviews, marine reviews, etc. It could be done, and it needs to be done by the government. I think the federal government should have the sole responsibility to conduct unbiased environmental reviews. That we deal with the backlog. We deal with the fact that with the $1 billion under NEPA, we will reach that 2-year threshold that the Trump administration wanted, that the Republican majority wanted, and senators, including Manchin, wanted. We can do the same with the other agencies as well. It is about backlog. It is not about continuing a self-fulfilling prophecy. And the prophecy has been to starve these departments so that you can claim that things are not being done in a timely fashion. This is an opportunity. The President has recommended in his budget to fully allow the transfer of money from the IRA to this review process with other agencies, not just NEPA. I think this amendment is redundant in the sense that we establish a dependency on outside funding from potential claimants to leases and permits within our federal lands and waters, and depend on them to be able to back that to deal with that backlog. If we're going to speed this up, let's do it correctly. Let's do it with the taxpayer and the American public's rights and public health in mind, and fund them fully, and allow the president and the departments to transfer money to the areas in which they're needed. That's what speeds it up. What we're doing today in terms of requiring a report will have no real effect on the backlog and opens the door to conflict of interest and corruption in our permitting process. With that, I yield back the balance.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Pennsylvania. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment number 34, printed in Part B of House Report 11830. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got an amendment at the desk as approved by the House Rules Committee.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 34, printed in Part B of House Report number 118-30, offered by Mr. Perry of Pennsylvania.
Pursuant to House Resolution 260, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry, and a member opposed. Each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The FAST Act provides for certain projects to be covered, which means projects that meet statutory requirements can gain voluntary access to a permitting timetable that contains all the necessary federal environmental reviews and authorizations in one centralized location. The underlying text ensures certain Defense Production Act projects also receive that covered status unless the project sponsors opt out. This amendment specifically excludes the Defense Production Act projects related to solar panel and EV projects from that preferential treatment. This amendment does not alter the actual authorities provided in the Defense Production Act. It just says that the administration, any administration, can't get special treatment for projects that have absolutely nothing to do with national security. Solar energy is often unreliable and cannot compete without subsidies. EVs cannot compete in a competitive market without subsidies. Using wartime, as far as I know, Congress hasn't declared war since I've been here. Using wartime authorities to subsidize these technologies simply doesn't change those facts. Worse yet, the projects empower the Chinese Communist Party and exploit their regime of slave labor. Roughly 50% of the world's polysilicon necessary to produce solar components come from Xinjiang, Turkmenistan, where they have the slave labor operation. Industry representatives have actually acknowledged the major disruption caused by this Congress's efforts to stop forced labor in the region. And we should try to stop it every way we can. And this is one of the ways. Again, the solution is not to abuse wartime authorities to prop up domestic industry incapable of making a profit without generous taxpayer subsidies. Finally, while this amendment is relatively narrow in scope, I hope we have a broader conversation about the Defense Production Act on our side of the aisle to prevent abuses from this and future administrations. I urge adoption of the amendment, and I reserve the balance.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from, for what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona rise?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise to claim time in opposition to the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I oppose the amendment. This amendment says that if the Secretary of Defense takes any action under the Defense Production Act related to solar panels or electric vehicles, it can't be treated as a covered project under FAST 41. Now, I have my own concerns about FAST 41, specifically around ensuring that communities have proper input in project permitting. But this amendment is a blatant attack on clean energy infrastructure. I cannot support it. I urge a no vote, and I reserve the balance.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, this is about using wartime powers, and we haven't declared war. But with that, I yield as much time as he may consume to the gentleman from Arkansas, the committee's full chairman, Mr. Westerman.
The gentleman from Arkansas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, thank you to the gentleman from Pennsylvania. I rise in support of his amendment. As we know, this bill is all about permit streamlining, including for domestic mineral projects. The underlying bill allows for mining projects that have received funding under the Defense Production Act to be placed on the existing FAST 41 permitting dashboard. My colleague's amendment states that mineral projects that contribute to certain technologies, such as electric vehicles, cannot be placed over and above other mine projects. This amendment also supports responsible deployment of funds under the Defense Production Act. Mineral production is vital to our national security, and HR1 creates multiple opportunities to streamline the process for mineral development. And Mr. Chair, I would also like to at this time recognize the Natural Resources Committee staff who worked tirelessly to advance HR1, the Lower Energy Cost Act. Thank you to Ashley Nichols, Rebecca Connelly, Rob McGregor, Tom Connolly, Chris Markland, Rebecca Hoshiko, Madeline Bryant, Kyle Weaver, Anelia Butler, Murray Miller, Sophia Varnasides, Will King, Nancy Peel, and Vivian Mogline. I also want to thank the members of the Republican Conference for all the work that they've put into this legislation and to their staffs. This has really been a team effort to get this bill to the floor in a record amount of time to address an issue that is very prevalent in our country, to lower energy costs, to make America energy independent, to increase our national security, to break supply chains on China, and to make America be the leader of the world in the future. HR1 is the first step to that, and we should be proud to have put it on the floor. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, to support the underlying bill. And with that, I yield back to the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
I thank the chairman and would echo his gratitude for the staff. There's long nights, there's a lot of details to be worked through, and to get these things right, we rely on folks that oftentimes are more the experts than we are in it. So we sure appreciate their sacrifices on our behalf and on behalf of the nation. With that, I yield the balance.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania's time has expired. Gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would be remiss after the chairman's acknowledgement of his staff not to do the same. I want to thank the staff on working for the Democrats in our committee very much for their hard work and their effort to keep the worst from happening with HR1. Their work has been phenomenal, and all of us on the committee as members are very appreciative. Again, let me just go back to Polluters Over People Act, HR1. HR1 is supposed to be the pinnacle, the apex of legislative action on the part of the Republican majority. And while we're doing this discussion, looming over the nation is the default and the debt ceiling, and the negotiations being promoted by the Republican majority, and the cuts that are being promoted to the basic services and programs that the American people not only depend on, but rely on for their lives. But we're not talking about that. All we're hearing is that if permitting doesn't happen the way that the industry wants it in terms of changing the basic laws that protect the American people, their health, and our environment, then we'll make that part of the hostage-taking in any discussion and any negotiations we have around the debt ceiling. We will continue to work hard, the Republican majority are saying, to gut NEPA, to gut basic environmental and bedrock and public health laws in this country, because that's the zenith of the effort. HR1 is not a legislative effort. It is a giveaway. It is empowering big oil and big gas to once again control the energy policy of this nation, ignore climate change, and cost the American people more and more through the cuts that are being anticipated and through the fact that we are not concentrating on their needs and concentrating on the needs of big oil and big gas, an industry that doesn't need our attention, doesn't need our help, and certainly does not need the handouts in HR1. And with that, I yield back the balance of our time.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Pennsylvania. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes.
Chairman.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New York rise?
I request a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6, Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Pennsylvania will be postponed. It is now in order to consider amendment number 35, printed in Part B of House Report 11830. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
I rise in support of the amendment. They ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 35, printed in Part B of House Report number 118-30, offered by Mr. Smith of New Jersey.
Pursuant to House Resolution 260, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, like canaries in coal mines, the recent spate of tragic whale and dolphin deaths and a well-founded suspicion, pardon me, that geophysical surveys, including the use of sonar, may be a contributing cause, has brought new light and increased scrutiny to the fast tracking of approximately 3,400 offshore wind turbines covering 2.4 million acres by 2030, more after that by 2040, all embedded into the ocean floor by massive pile drivers in the North Atlantic planning area that includes New Jersey's coast. The offshore wind industrialization approval process has left unaddressed and unanswered numerous serious questions concerning the potentially harmful environmental impacts on whales, marine life, and the ecosystems that currently allow all sea creatures, great and small, to thrive. Cindy Ziff, Executive Director of the Clean Ocean Action, pointed out in testimony at a field hearing chaired by my good friend and colleague Jeff Van Drew that the National Marine Fisheries Service has said, quote, offshore wind is a new use of our marine waters, requiring substantial scientific and regulatory review. So she asks, where is the substantial review? My amendment, Mr. Speaker, requires the U.S. Government Accountability Office, or GAO, to investigate the sufficiency of the environmental review process for offshore wind projects of the Marine Fisheries Service and the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and any other relevant federal agency. Among other concerns, GAO would be required to investigate and report to Congress on the impacts of offshore wind on whales, finfish and marine mammals, commercial and recreational fishing, recreation and tourism, invertebrates, essential fish habitat, resources, cultural, historical, and archaeological resources, sustainable of shoreline beaches and inlets, military use and navigation, vessel traffic, and the impacts of hurricanes and other severe weather on offshore wind projects. The GAO would also be tasked to reveal how the agencies determine which stakeholders are consulted, whether a timely, comprehensive comment period is provided for local representation and interested parties, and the estimated cost and who pays for the offshore wind projects. Mr. Speaker, if and when wind projects go online, vessel navigation, including U.S. Navy ships, merchant cargo and ships, fishing boats, and search and rescue operations by the Coast Guard may be significantly hampered due to radar interference. The National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine released a report in 2022, a year ago, entitled Wind Turbine Generator Impact on Marine Vessel Radar, and found that wind turbine generators, quote, obfuscate the marine vessel radar for both magnetron-based and solid-state radar and can cause significant interference and shadowing that suppress detection and small contacts, close quote. The study also found that wind turbine mitigation techniques for marine vessel radar have not, and I repeat, have not been substantially investigated, implemented, matured, or deployed. That study was from 1 year ago. The vulnerability of massive structures the size of the Chrysler Building to hurricanes, nor'easters, and superstorms has not been adequately investigated and vetted either. Yet one study in 2012 found that there is very substantial risk that a Category 3 and higher hurricane can destroy half or more of the turbines at some locations. Remember, these are about 1,000 feet tall. They could topple like dominoes. Any surface appeal argument made by the industry or by the government comparing it to the survivability of wind turbines of the East Coast to the UK or Norway fails because Europe doesn't get hurricanes. They get remnants of our hurricanes. They get bad weather, but they don't get hurricanes. In like manner, the devastating impact on commercial and recreational fishing has been largely ignored. One expert, Megan Lamp, said at Mr. Van Drew's hearing, tremendous testimony, we are facing the annihilation of our industry at the hands of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. New Jersey's amazing shore tourism industry is also being put at grave risk. Mr. Speaker, with so much at stake, and out of an abundance of caution and concern, support for my amendment to require a comprehensive and independent review by GAO is absolutely warranted. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I claim time in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I oppose the amendment. This amendment requires the Government Accountability Office to study the sufficiency of current environmental review process for offshore wind projects. I think we can all agree that offshore energy projects, including offshore wind projects, need to be studied thoroughly before being built. And the National Environmental Policy Act helps us do that through their review. But HR1, the Polluters Over People Act, guts the National Environmental Policy Act. If I lived in any of these coastal communities, I'd be pretty nervous about how HR1 makes it harder for stakeholders to weigh in on projects that might affect their communities. This amendment scrutinizes the environmental review process for renewable energy development, but the underlying bill guts the review process for offshore development. Now, as we've seen in the Gulf, the infrastructure needed for oil and gas drilling has decimated wetlands, and oil spills like the BP disaster, close beaches and kill wildlife. Scientists have found this seismic surveys for offshore oil exploration are far more damaging to marine mammals than surveys for offshore wind. A couple-page GAO study on whether environmental reviews of offshore wind is strong enough doesn't make up for the cuts to those reviews in HR1. A path forward is to reject the Polluters Over People Act and instead make sure federal agencies have the tools, the capacity, and the resources they need to complete reviews in a timely fashion. I urge my colleagues to reject this amendment, and I reserve the balance. No, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Jersey. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, on that I would ask for a recorded vote.
Requesting the recorded vote. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Jersey will be postponed. It is now in order to consider amendment number 36, printed in Part B of House Report 118-30. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 36, printed in Part B of House Report number 118-30, offered by Mr. Van Drew of New Jersey.
Pursuant to House Resolution 260, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Van Drew, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you. And before I begin, I want to thank the chairman for his help and his support. I want to thank Congressman Dr. Andy Harris for traveling the great distance to New Jersey to be at the hearing that we had in field. I want to thank Congressman Chris Smith for his support in traveling as well, and Congressman Scott Perry, all of whom were there. I rise today in support of my amendment and to clear up the misconceptions and that continue to float around amongst the mainstream media, this administration, and pro-wind advocacy groups, and highlight what is nothing less than an existential threat to our coastlines and the millions of people and communities who rely upon them. Proponents of offshore wind claim that it is a necessary step in order to transition the United States to clean energy. Yet, oddly enough, BOEM's own environmental impact statement admits that offshore wind will have no impact of any substance in combating climate change and will, in fact, increase greenhouse gas emissions. Proponents say that it will stimulate economic activity and create thousands of jobs. Yet offshore wind turbines are being constructed in Europe and China, and not in the United States. And offshore wind companies are attempting to circumvent the Jones Act so they can use cheaper foreign vessels and cheaper crews. Plus, BOEM has admitted that the commercial fisheries will have to this is important, will have to completely abandon their fishing grounds as the result of offshore wind. Destroying one job to create another is not job creation. Let's talk about the offshore wind companies themselves. Ørsted, who is building offshore wind farms off New Jersey's coast, is based in Denmark and used to go by the name Danish Oil and Natural Gas. Equinor, who is building offshore wind farms off of New York, is based in Norway and a self-described petroleum refining company. British Petroleum, BP, who is building offshore wind farms off New York and Massachusetts, is based in England. Avangrid, who is building offshore wind farms off Connecticut, has its parent company based in Spain. These are foreign-owned companies that have bought millions, not thousands, I'm not exaggerating here, millions of acres of our ocean, our American ocean in the Atlantic, and intend to expand into the Gulf, Pacific Ocean, and our Great Lakes as well. Every body of water in this country is blessed with, and now will be at the mercy of foreign-owned energy companies, thanks to the Biden administration. More than 50% of our energy, if this plan was to go to fruition, would come from foreign countries. We would rely upon them, and they'd be under our control. That's shameful. They say that surveying and construction of these offshore wind farms is not resulting in marine mammal deaths. Well, I've lived there, and I see it. But that begs the question, why is BOEM offering incidental take authorizations to these companies? And for those that don't know what that means, a take, for those that don't understand it, is the accidental harming or killing of marine species. And it's not just whales, it's dolphins and others. Wind companies need these ITAs because these industrial wind grids are leased right on top of the foraging grounds and the migration routes for the critically endangered North Atlantic right whale. NOAA's own scientists have sounded the alarms on how these projects will affect right whales, not just now, but for many decades to come. I beg to differ. I beg to differ with the proponents who claim that offshore wind will boost our ecotourism along the coast. Would you choose to go to a shore that consisted of thousands of industrialized wind turbines that rise to nearly 1,000 feet tall and realize that there's no casino in Atlantic City that is this tall? Well, Ørsted themselves conducted a survey in my home county of Cape May, which is a tourist county, on whether tourists would return after these wind grids are built. 15% said they wouldn't even think about returning. Ørsted considered this a good thing. I will finish up. Perhaps they forgot to look into what it would do. It would be a loss of $1 billion. You could talk about defense, and I will yield back, but you could talk about defense
has
and
expired.
Standing up for my constituents. I yield back. Please vote for this bill.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise to claim the time in opposition to the
The gentleman
amendment.
is recognized for 5 minutes.
I would like to yield as much time as he may consume to the gentleman from New York and our leader in the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Nadler.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Thank you, Ranking Member Grijalva, for your leadership in opposition to the Polluters Over People Act. And I must say, the concern of the gentleman from New Jersey we just heard about ocean animals is touching, considering the effect that climate change will do for all of this wildlife, and all of us for that matter. Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to this bad faith amendment aimed at slowing our nation's transition to the affordable clean energy economy we need to address the climate crisis and create good-paying American jobs.
With nearly 164,000 New Yorkers already working in the clean energy industry, the state is expected to create more than 10,000 additional jobs through its commitment to developing 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind energy in the coming years. If you're worried about the potential adverse effects of wind for energy development, you will be pleased to know that the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management is already required to perform substantial environmental reviews. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management's Renewable Energy Program subject matter experts are best equipped to analyze potential environmental and industry impacts of offshore wind. Considering this, it's strange that my colleague from New Jersey is supporting an appropriations request to defund the Renewable Energy Program. It's also strange that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle claim to worry about the industry's impact on whales when most of them oppose the North Atlantic right whale vessel strike reduction rule. The data shows that most whale killings are attributed to vessel strikes. Again, this is a bad faith attack on offshore wind, and I urge my colleagues to oppose it. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you very much. As we finish the amendment process under the jurisdiction of the Natural Resources Committee, let me just close by saying that Polluters Over People Act, HR1, has one distinct and sole purpose. That's to dismantle, weaken, eliminate basic laws and legal protections that have been in place for over 50 years around important issues of public health, environment. And what we've heard today as rationales has been permitting reform. What we heard as rationale is energy independence and dominance. But the sole purpose, these concepts are dog whistles. They're dog whistles for climate denial and no action. They're dog whistles for having corporate dominance, not public interest, in charge of our most vital natural resources, especially its people. HR1, Polluter Over People Act, is a basic assault on the public health, the public interest, and prevents us from dealing with the reality of climate change and the need to take action now. With that, let me yield back the balance of our time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Jersey. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Chairman.
For what purpose the gentleman from Arizona?
On that, I would ask for a recorded vote.
The gentleman requested a recorded vote in pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18. Further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Jersey will be postponed. It is now in order to consider amendment number 37, printed in Part B of House Report 118-30. For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition?
Amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 37, printed in Part B of House Report number 118-30, offered by Mr. Graves of Louisiana.
Pursuant to House Resolution 260, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Graves, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this amendment has a very simple objective. All it's designed to do is provide certainty. They have discharge permits that are granted often to ports, to vessels, large and small, and different operators that are required to discharge, making sure that what they're discharging is properly evaluated to ensure that it doesn't cause adverse impact to the environment. These permits are normally granted for a 5-year period of time, but what we found is that upon expiration of the permits, we've seen gaps of months and months and months, creating uncertainty for those operators. What this amendment does is it very simply says that if a permit expires, you just get a continuance. You get a continuance of the existing permit conditions until the agency works to recertify or to re-up the permit. The second thing that it does is it says that if you have a continuing operation, and if there are some changes that the agency wants in regard to the operations of the permit, then that's fine, but you have to begin that process 2 years ahead of time, giving the operators ample time to adjust or adapt to the new conditions. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I urge adoption of the amendment, and I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. What purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise to claim time in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I oppose this amendment, and while I recognize the amendment's underlying goal to make it easier to obtain Clean Water Act permit, not all permits have the same potential impacts on water quality. We need to take care to distinguish between those permits that can be expedited because of their minimal impact on the environment and those that need additional attention and scrutiny. The Clean Water Act already authorizes the use of general permits to allow a more expedited process for activities in the wetlands that will cause only minimal adverse environmental effects when performed separately and will have only minimal cumulative adverse effects on the environment. Current EPA regulations also allow the issuance of general permits for point source discharges that involve the same or substantially similar types of operations, such as construction-related activities, urban stormwater, and the Western and Central Gulf of Mexico offshore oil and gas activities. The amendment attempts to codify existing EPA regulations on general use permits for point source discharges without the safeguard that the activities have only a minimal impact on the environment. The amendment does not prescribe how these new requirements will interact with existing general permit authority. Conflicting standards may have the opposite effect that the representative intends. It may restrict EPA's authority to determine which activities are eligible to use the more streamlined process of obtaining general permit coverage, and those activities more appropriately reviewed under a more rigorous individual permit authority. This will bogging down the EPA with layers of rules will not make obtaining a permit easier. The amendment also expands who can apply an expired general use permit to new projects. Under current law, current permittees who file a notice of intent to be covered under a general use permit scheduled for reissuance remain covered by the previous permit, even if there should be a lapse between expiration and reissuance. The amendment requires the new applicant also be allowed to use expired permit regardless of whether or not the permit is likely to be renewed. Allowing automatic expansion of permits that have not been renewed for legitimate concerns will not improve water quality. I stand ready to work with the representative or any other colleague who seek to a sensible permitting reform while continuing to uphold our nation's water quality. However, this amendment does not uphold our nation's water quality, and that is why I will oppose it. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, thankfully, the amendment described by the ranking member is not the amendment that we're offering today. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Alabama, member of the Natural Resources Committee.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate our colleagues on the other side of the aisle pointing out all these different rules and regulations that we have to go through for a vessel to simply come in and out. This regulation is very simple. It says if you have a permit today and it expires today, that permit is good until the new permit is issued. It has nothing to do with further checking of water quality, because that's already set up in the first permit, and the layers of government bureaucracy are already put in place. All this bill very simply says is you can continue running your business until we have time to do our job. It is hard to run a business based on the federal government's time clock, because the government gets in no hurry. The slower they get, the more important they feel, and the business community cannot handle this. We've got to give the business community some help, and this is help. And again, this is simply saying is you carry on the way that you have agreed to carry on for the last 5 years, and we will get to you as quick as we can. And I think it's a great bill, and I'm here to support it. Thank you, sir. Give my time back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized.
Reserve.
Take it. The gentleman has the only time remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Prepared to close. I recognize myself. Mr. Chairman, I just want to clarify again. The ranking member's comments, while clearly concerning, do not apply to this amendment. Mr. Chairman, I want to read from the amendment. The administrator is authorized. It doesn't say they shall. It says is authorized. Its second section says the administrator may require. These are discretionary. These are discretionary terms. There's nothing in here that's mandatory. It creates the ability of the administrator to offer to offer a general permit. But most importantly, let's keep in mind, this doesn't waive any environmental laws or anything along those lines. What this does is it simply says that if a permit has been issued and the agency is not fast enough in re-upping the permit, then what happens is that you continue operating under the previously approved permit. Now, if the agency wants to reject a permit, if they want to take an action, all of that discretion is still retained by the administrator. Reserve the balance.
The gentleman reserves.
Right, so we're going to him. Mr. Chairman, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Louisiana, the distinguished majority leader and the sponsor of this legislation, Congressman Steve Scalise.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank my friend from Louisiana, Mr. Graves, for yielding, for his leadership on this, bringing this amendment, which I support, and especially bringing this bill. Mr. Chairman, we all ought to be focused on helping low-income families who are struggling. Families all across America are struggling under the weight of high inflation, all the spending that's come out of Washington under President Biden, but especially led and driven by this anti-American energy policy that we've seen from President Biden that has dramatically increased costs on American families. And how are people getting hit by all of President Biden's anti-American energy policies? You could see it right here. Gas prices, every time you go to the pump, 50% more people are paying. That takes money out of families' paychecks every single week when they go to fill up their vehicle. You look at the utility bills people are paying. 40% more, 25% more in some areas of the country that they're paying more in their utility bills, making it harder for them to heat their homes in a cold winter. As we approach summer, people want to turn on their air conditioning. They're going to be paying a lot more. That takes money out of their pocket. And oh, by the way, when you look at what President Biden passed last year, he passed a $6 billion tax increase on natural gas, which is one of the drivers of higher electricity bills. The good news is, Mr. Chairman, Republicans have answered the pleas that so many families have been raising by bringing the Lower Energy Costs Act to the floor. HR1, this is a bill focused on helping those families who have been struggling, who have been saying for the last 2 years, is anybody in Washington looking out for the families who are living paycheck to paycheck, who cannot make ends meet, who are sick and tired of runaway inflation and higher costs? And the answer is yes, House Republicans are here with an answer to this problem. I think it's important to understand how we got here. It wasn't by accident. President Biden, as a candidate, said he was going to go and try to destroy the energy industry, stop drilling in America. Day one, the day President Biden took office, he started taking immediate action to attack American energy. He canceled the Keystone Pipeline. He started putting his bureaucrats in place to put red tape in the way of American production of oil and natural gas. Now, you may think that's because the president is against pipelines and the president is against oil and natural gas. He's not. In fact, while the President Biden was canceling the Keystone Pipeline from Canada to the United States, he green-lighted a pipeline from Russia to Germany. So he bailed out Putin while he was sticking it to families in America, and they paid a higher price for it here at home. Then, the same time he was making it harder to produce energy in America, getting agencies to stop issuing permits, canceling lease sales. It wasn't because he was against oil and gas. No, because during that time that he was making it harder to get oil and gas in America, he was calling Vladimir Putin again, there's that name, calling Russia, asking them to produce more oil for America. Putin said no. So then he got on Air Force One. Now all these climate justice warriors that fly all around the world in their private jets. Air Force One, the last time I checked, there's no solar panels on the wings of Air Force One. It takes jet fuel. He flew to Saudi Arabia, and he begged Saudi to produce more oil. So again, he's not against oil. He's just against American oil. Well, the Saudis said no because the Saudis want a high price for gasoline. Who pays for that? Hardworking families. So why don't we ask this question? If the president's not against oil, he's just against American oil, where are we getting our energy from? Where are we getting our critical minerals from? They talk about electric vehicles as if everybody's driving electric cars. You know, one day, maybe that's where the world goes. Technology still needs to advance a lot to get to that point, but today you might be less than 10% of the cars on the road are electric. But if you're going to advance it, like California says, they're going to ban fossil fuel cars in California. Of course, ironically, the governor, days after he said he's going to ban fossil fuel cars, told people they cannot plug their electric car into the socket because they're about to have power outages because the grid can't handle it. Again, where does the energy come from? You don't plug that electric car into a tree. You've got to actually use baseload energy. Where does the battery come from, by the way, that you're charging? Well, we know right now the batteries are coming from China. President Biden has made it very clear. He wants to make it harder to produce in America. But he's not against the production. He's going to countries like Russia, like China, like Venezuela, look at the list. Are these the people we want to become dependent on? So the question is no longer, do we or do we not get oil? It's where we get it from. Now, what Republicans have said and what HR1 gets us back to is why don't we get our energy from America? It's a pretty straightforward answer. President Biden said no to America, but again, begging Russia, begging Saudi Arabia, begging Venezuela. He's trying to ease sanctions on Venezuela right now to get more of their oil. Well, if it's all about carbon emissions and saving the planet, why don't we use the facts? Let's talk science for a moment. Who is the cleanest place to make things in the world? Who has the highest standards? I know some on the left wake up every day and they just want to trash America. We have the best standards in the world. If you want to make oil anywhere in the world, and again, they're not against oil. They just don't want it made in America. But look at the countries that they're begging to make more oil. Countries that emit more carbon to make the same oil. Then they put that oil on a tanker and send it to the United States. Think of the lunacy of that policy. We'd love to make it here and put it in a pipeline, which is the safest way to transport it. They don't even want you to be able to build the pipelines. We ease that in the bill so we can actually build real infrastructure in America. So if you're worried about carbon emissions, the good news for you, the Lower Energy Cost Act solves that problem because by making it America, you make it in the best place in the world. We also address critical minerals. You want to make computer chips? You want to make electric car batteries? They're going to be made somewhere in the world. Where are they going to be made? Right now, under President Biden's policies, it's almost impossible to get permits to mine for those minerals in America. So they're getting made. Problem is they're getting made in countries like China. Go look at the environmental standards of China. I know the president's energy secretary just a few days ago said that we can learn something from China on clean energy. I'm not sure if she's been traveling around America. I know she's traveling around to other countries. How could you possibly say we could learn from China? No one does it cleaner than America, but many would argue no one does it dirtier than China. Why would you want to be making our country more dependent on China? In our bill, we actually say we can make those things in America again. We have them here. Look at the plaque right above the Speaker's rostrum. Let us develop the resources of our land. Well, Mr. Speaker, we actually do fulfill that promise in this bill by letting us develop the resources in our land, not in China. They can go make stuff in China. We shouldn't be addicted to those products because President Biden shut off our ability to make things in America. These policies make nothing but common sense. And the good thing about it is you don't just get the advantages of lower carbon emissions globally by passing this bill. For families across America who are sick and tired of the lunacy and hypocrisy of the left's policies, it lowers costs for families. There's only one free market country in the world that has abundant resources. That's America. You look at the other countries that we become dependent on, They want a higher price. They're part of cartels like OPEC. We can make OPEC irrelevant if we make more energy in America. We've got the resources. You can go to Port Fourchon in South Louisiana, my district, and see areas where we can produce hundreds of thousands of barrels a day that are being closed off, that are being almost impossible for them to get permits. They can't even move pipelines. Go to Pennsylvania, where they can produce oil and natural gas, but they can't even get it to their neighbors in New York and the New England states because they're abusing federal laws and all of these different agencies to stop the building of the infrastructure for pipelines. And their argument is that they don't want oil and natural gas. Well, they're getting the oil and natural gas. They're just getting it from other countries, from tankers coming into New England states instead of pipelines made in America. None of this makes any sense. There's an answer. The answer is, let's stand up for those families who are sick and tired of paying more when they know we've got the ability here to do it ourselves. We can become energy independent again. It's a national security issue, but it's a bread and butter kitchen table issue for those families who are struggling. Stop being dependent on foreign countries like President Biden's made us. Let's get back to the sound principles that have been proven to work. And again, in the cleanest place to make things in the world, the United States of America. Let's stand up for those families who are sick and tired of paying too much. Let's actually get good policy put into law that fights for those families who have been left behind for far too long. Let's pass the Lower Energy Costs Act. Let's get this country back on track, and let's lower prices for those families who are struggling. With that, Mr. Speaker, I urge passage, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, yield back.